The rain started at midnight, and by the time Dominic Vale scaled the east wall of the Reyes estate, it had turned the world into a curtain of static gray. He didn't mind. Rain was good. Rain covered footsteps, muffled breathing, and washed blood off marble before anyone noticed it was there. He had waited 4 years for this night. The Reyes estate sat on 11 acres above the harbor, a monument to a man who had built his empire on other men's ruin. Salvatore Reyes had spent 3 decades buying judges, burning warehouses, and disappearing anyone who threatened his supply lines. He had also, 4 years ago, ordered the deaths of Dominic's father and older brother in a single night, a message delivered in blood to remind the Vale family who really owned the docks. Dominic had spent those 4 years building himself into something the old man would fear. He had taken the scattered remains of his father's organization and forged them into something leaner, colder, more disciplined. He didn't do it for the money. He didn't do it for the territory. He did it so that one night, exactly like this one, he could walk into Salvatore Reyes's house and end him with his own hands. He had studied the estate for 3 of those 4 years before he ever set foot on the grounds. He knew the names of the household staff, the shift schedules of the guards, the make and model of every camera bolted to the perimeter wall. He knew that Salvatore drank 2 fingers of whiskey at 9 o'clock sharp every night, a habit so rigid his own men joked that you could set your watch by the clink of ice in his glass. He knew the old man slept with a pistol in the nightstand and a second one taped beneath the headboard, because paranoia was the only thing that had kept him alive as long as it had. What Dominic did not know, could not have known, no matter how many months he'd spent watching that house through a long lens from the tree line, was that someone inside those walls had been running her own 4-year countdown, quieter and more patient than his, and that hers was about to finish first. He dropped silently from the wall into the west garden, a shadow among shadows, and moved toward the service entrance his informant had marked on the blueprints. 2 guards patrolled the perimeter on a 14-minute rotation. He had 11 minutes before the gap closed. He didn't need 11. He needed 4. The lock on the service door gave way under his pick-in under a minute. He slipped inside, into a narrow hallway that smelled of bleach and old stone, and began moving toward the east wing, where Salvatore's private study connected to his bedroom through a single unguarded passage, the only blind spot Dominic's surveillance had ever found in 4 years of watching this house breathe. He was 3 turns from the study when he saw the light. A single lamp glowed at the far end of the servants' corridor, spilling gold across the flagstones. Dominic flattened himself against the wall, weapon rising instinctively, and waited for whoever was foolish enough to be awake at this hour to pass. No one passed. Instead, a voice came from the small pantry just ahead, quiet, unhurried, almost conversational. A woman's voice. "You can come out. I already know you're not one of his men." Dominic went very still. He considered his options in the space of half a breath. Retreat, silence her, wait her out. Instead, and later he would wonder what exactly made him do it, he stepped into the doorway with his gun raised. The woman sitting at the small servants' table didn't flinch. She was maybe 26, dressed in the plain gray uniform of household staff, her dark hair pulled back in a knot that had started to come loose sometime during a very long shift. She had a dish towel in her hands, and she was folding it slowly, methodically, the way a person folds something when they need their hands to do anything other than shake. She looked at the gun. Then she looked at him. "You're here for him," she said. It wasn't a question. "Who are you?" His voice came out lower and rougher than he intended. "Mira," she said. "I clean his floors. I iron his shirts. I've worked in this house for 6 years." She set the folded towel down with exaggerated care. "You're gonna want to sit down before you go up there. I don't take orders in enemy houses." "It's not an order." A small, tired smile crossed her face, the first crack in her composure. "It's a courtesy, because in about 20 minutes it's not gonna matter whether you go up there or not." Dominic's finger did not leave the trigger guard, but something in his chest went very cold and very alert. "Explain." Mira Solis looked toward the ceiling, toward the east wing, toward the man sleeping 2 floors above them who did not know he was already dying. "I poisoned him," she said, 3 hours ago. In his nightly whiskey. It'll stop his heart sometime before dawn, and there's nothing anyone can do about it now. because I use something that doesn't show up until it's already finished the job. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Rain ticked against the high pantry window. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the half-hour. Dominic Vale, who had planned this night for 4 years down to the second, found himself standing in a dim little pantry, holding a gun on a maid who had apparently beaten him to his own revenge by several hours, and he began, very slowly, to smile. "Say that again," he said. Mira met his eyes without blinking. "I already poisoned him." He lowered the gun, not because he trusted her, but because a woman who had just confessed to murdering the most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard was not, in that moment, his most pressing threat. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, weapon resting on his knee, eyes never leaving her face. "You're going to tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning. And you're going to tell me fast, because I don't particularly want to be standing in this house when the body's found." Myra's hands, which had been so steady folding the towel, began to tremble now that the confession was out. She pressed them flat against the table to still them. "My sister worked here before me," she said.
Elena.
She was 17 when she started, cleaning mostly, sometimes serving at his dinners when he had guests. He liked her. Myra's jaw tightened. He liked her the way men like Salvatore Reyes like things they think they own. Dominic said nothing. He had heard enough stories about Salvatore Reyes over the years, about the parties, about the girls who worked in that house and then quietly stopped working there, that he didn't need her to spell it out further. But she did anyway, because some stories only become bearable once they're finally spoken aloud. "She tried to leave after the first time," Mira said. "He told her if she left, he'd make sure our mother's restaurant lost its lease, its permits, everything. He told her he owned this whole side of the city and there was nowhere she could go that his people wouldn't find. She stayed. For 2 years, she stayed. And then one night she didn't come home, and 3 days later they found her in the harbor, and the police report said accidental drowning, and nobody in this city was foolish enough to say otherwise out loud. She looked up at him then, and there was nothing soft left in her face. I took her job 4 months later. I told myself it was so I could watch him, learn his patterns, find a way to make him answer for it. It took me 2 years to get close enough to his private stock to do anything about it, and it took me another year after that to find a poison slow enough and clean enough that no medical examiner in his pocket would ever think to look for it." She exhaled, long and shaking. "Tonight was supposed to be the night. I put it in his glass at 9. He drank it at 9:15, same as every night for 6 years. And then I came down here to wait, because I didn't know what else to do with myself." Dominic studied her for a long moment. He had killed men for less noble reasons than what this woman had just done for her sister's memory, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he believed every word of it. "How long until it takes effect?" he asked. "Before sunrise. Maybe an hour, maybe 3. It's not exact." She looked at him properly for the first time since he'd stepped into the doorway. "Why are you here? What did he take from you?" "My father. My brother. 4 years ago on the docks." Dominic's voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man who had said those words to himself so many times in the dark that they no longer had the power to break him, only to focus him. "I came here to put a bullet in him myself. I wanted him to know exactly whose hand was doing it and exactly why." Something shifted in Myra's expression. Not pity, exactly, but recognition. The particular, quiet kinship of 2 people who had both spent years building a single night out of grief. "Then I'm sorry I got here first," she said, and she meant it as an apology, not a taunt. Dominic almost laughed. It came out as something closer to a rough exhale. "Don't be. A bullet's quick. Painless, if I'm being honest, which I wasn't planning to be. Whatever you gave him, how does it feel? What's it doing to him right now? His organs are failing. Slowly. He'll wake up around 3 or 4 in pain he won't understand. And by the time anyone realizes it's serious, it'll be too late to matter." Myra's voice didn't waver. "It's not painless. I made sure of that." The 2 of them sat in silence for a moment, listening to the rain, listening to the house creak and settle around the dying man sleeping 2 floors above them. "You should go," Mira said finally. "If his men find you here when it happens, they'll assume you did it. You'll be dead by morning or worse, and I'll have wasted 3 years of my life for nothing. And what happens to you? I clean his floors, she said simply. Same as always. I'm the maid. Nobody looks twice at the maid. Dominic studied her. The exhaustion carved into her face, the steadiness of her hands now that the confession was finished, the particular hardness in her eyes that he recognized because he saw it in the mirror every morning. This was not a woman asking to be saved. This was a woman who had already saved herself, in the only way this world had left available to her, and was now prepared to disappear back into the wallpaper of a house that had never once seen her as anything more than furniture that dusted itself. No, he said. Mira blinked. No? You're not staying here. He stood, and for the first time he holstered the gun. If his men do any kind of investigation, and they will because his organization doesn't survive without him, and every lieutenant in that house is going to be looking for someone to blame so they can seize power before the others do. The maid who's worked here for 6 years and happened to be awake the night he died is exactly who they'll look at first. I have nowhere else to go. You have me. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. He hadn't planned to say them. He hadn't planned for any of this, for a poisoned enemy, for a grieving maid, for a night that had unspooled entirely differently than the 4 years of careful preparation had promised. But he found, sitting in that small pantry with the rain drumming overhead, that he did not particularly want to walk out of this house and leave her behind to face whatever came next alone. I don't know you, Mira said carefully. You know I came here to kill the same man you already killed. That's more common ground than most people ever get. He held out his hand, not a demand, an offer. My car's parked 2 streets over. I can have you somewhere safe before the sun's up. Somewhere his men will never think to look. And somewhere you can finally stop being the maid who dusts herself. For a long moment, Mira looked at his outstretched hand as though it might be a trick, as though 6 years in this house had trained her to expect every offered kindness to have a hook buried somewhere inside it. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. If this is a trick, she said, I want you to know I still have half a vial of what I used on him. Dominic actually smiled at that. A real smile, the first genuine one to cross his face in longer than he could remember. Good, he said. I'd rather work with someone dangerous than someone soft. Come on. We don't have much time. They left through the same service door he'd picked open 20 minutes earlier, slipping through the gap in the guard's rotation with 4 minutes to spare. The rain had not let up. If anything, it had gotten heavier, and Dominic found himself grateful for it, for the noise it made against the stone, for the visibility it stole from the cameras mounted along the perimeter wall, for the simple mercy of weather that didn't care whose side it was on. They reached his car, a nondescript sedan parked beneath a dead street lamp 2 blocks from the estate, and he had her inside and moving before either guard had completed another circuit. Neither of them spoke for the first several minutes. Mira sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring out at the rain-streaked city passing in the dark, and Dominic drove with the particular tension of a man recalculating an entire plan in real time. Where are we going? She finally asked. Somewhere safe. I have a property outside the city, not one of my known holdings, nothing that connects to me on paper. You'll stay there until we know how this shakes out. And if his men figure out it was poison, not natural causes, they will, Dominic said grimly. Men like Salvatore Reyes don't just die quietly, not without someone asking questions. But by the time they think to look for you, you'll be somewhere they can't find you, and I'll have made sure there's no thread leading back to that pantry. Mira turned to look at him, studying his profile in the passing streetlight. You said you spent 4 years planning to kill him yourself. What happens now? You didn't get the ending you wanted. Dominic was quiet for a moment, his jaw working. I got a different ending, he said finally. He's dying in pain, in his own house, at the hands of a woman he thought he owned and never once saw coming. That's not the ending I planned. But I'm finding it's not one I mind either. You're not angry that I took it from you? I spent 4 years imagining his face when he realized it was me, Dominic admitted. But I think I'll take more satisfaction knowing his last conscious thought was probably confusion, that the maid who ironed his shirts and never said a word out of place was the one who finally made him answer for what he did. He glanced over at her. That's a better story than mine would have been. Mira looked back out the window, and for the first time since he'd found her in that pantry, something in her posture loosened. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the first small unclenching of a person who had been braced for 6 years and had, for just a moment remembered what it felt like to breathe. They drove in silence for a while longer, the wipers ticking rhythm against the glass, the city thinning out behind them into scattered lights and then darkness. Mira watched the last street lamp disappear in the side mirror. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead. When you were watching this house, all those months, however long it was, did you ever see me? Did you know who I was before tonight?" Dominic considered the question honestly before he answered. "I saw a woman in a gray uniform who hung the wash on Tuesdays and carried in the groceries on Thursdays. I didn't know your name. I didn't know anything about you." He paused. "I'm not proud of that. I spent 3 years cataloging every guard, every camera, every habit of a man I hated, and I never once wondered what it cost the people who had to work in his house every day just to survive." "Most people don't," Mira said, without bitterness, just fact. "That's how men like him stay in business. Nobody looks past the uniform." "I'm looking now." She didn't answer that, but something in her shoulders eased another degree. And for the rest of the drive, the silence between them felt less like distance and more like two people quietly getting used to no longer being alone. The house Dominic drove them to was nothing like the Reyes estate. A modest stone farmhouse an hour outside the city, tucked at the end of a gravel road with no name, surrounded by nothing but dark fields and the occasional distant light of a neighbor who had learned, long ago, not to ask questions about the comings and goings at the end of that road. It belonged to no one on paper. It existed, as far as any official record was concerned, as an empty parcel abandoned by a family that had moved away 30 years earlier. He led her inside, flipped on a single lamp in the front room, and watched her take in the space. Plain furniture, a stone hearth, curtains drawn tight against windows that faced nothing but empty fields. "You'll be safe here," he said. "There's food in the kitchen, clothes in the closet upstairs that should fit you well enough for now. I'll have someone bring more supplies within the day. Someone you trust." "The only two people I trust are already dead," Dominic said, and there was no bitterness in it, only fact. "But I have people who are loyal because it's profitable for them to be, and profitable loyalty is reliable enough so long as you never confuse it for the other kind." Mira sat down slowly on the edge of a worn armchair, and for the first time since the pantry, the full weight of the night seemed to land on her at once. Her shoulders dropped. Her hands, which had been so carefully controlled all evening, finally began to shake in earnest. "I've thought about that moment for 3 years," she said quietly. "I thought it would feel like something. Relief, maybe, or triumph. I don't feel either of those things." Dominic crouched down in front of her chair, bringing himself level with her eyes. "It won't, not for a while. I know that better than I'd like to." He hesitated, then added, "The day I finally tracked down the man who pulled the trigger on my father, I thought the same thing you're thinking now. I thought killing him would fill some hole. Didn't. It just meant I finally had room to grieve properly, instead of just being angry." "Is that what this is? Room to grieve?" "That's what it can be if you let it." He studied her face. Really studied it, the exhaustion and the grief and the flickers of something steadier underneath. Something that had survived 6 years in that house and come out the other side still capable of folding a dish towel with careful, deliberate hands even while she waited to find out whether a man would die from the poison she'd given him. "You did something tonight most people spend their whole lives being too afraid to do. Whatever you feel right now, give it time. The relief comes. Sometimes it takes weeks, but it comes." Mira looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face softened. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of it, the first tentative step toward believing that the man who had broken into that house with a gun and murder in his eyes might, against every reasonable expectation, actually mean her well. "Thank you," she said, "for not leaving me there." "I couldn't," Dominic said simply. "Not after everything you told me. Not after I understood exactly what you'd survived to get to that pantry tonight." He stood, offering her his hand one more time. Not to lead her anywhere this time, just an offer. A small gesture of solidarity between two people who had both spent years carrying the same kind of weight. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we figure out what comes next. Tonight you did what you set out to do. That's enough for now." Dawn found Salvatore Reyes dead in his bed, his face frozen in an expression his staff would later describe, in hushed and frightened tones, as pure confusion. as though even in his final moment he could not comprehend how the world had finally caught up with him. By noon, the news had reached every corner of the underworld that had once trembled at the sound of his name. By evening, 3 of his lieutenants were already circling each other over the scraps of his empire, each one convinced that a rival had finally found the nerve to strike. No one thought to look for a maid, at least not yet. The trouble began 4 days later. Dominic had spent those 4 days moving carefully, checking in with his own people, tracing the fractures spreading through what remained of the Reyes organization, making certain no one had seen his car near the estate that night. No one had clocked his face on any camera his people hadn't already scrubbed. He'd left Mira at the farmhouse with strict instructions. Don't answer the door, don't use the landline, don't so much as light a fire after dark unless the curtains were drawn tight enough to hide the smoke. She had listened. She had also, he discovered on the 4th morning, spent every one of those 4 days learning the layout of the house well enough to have identified 3 separate ways out if she ever needed them, and had quietly moved a kitchen knife to a spot beneath the armchair where she sat each evening. He noticed it when he came to check on her and saw the handle catching lamplight beneath the cushion. "You don't trust me yet," he said, not accusingly, just an observation. "I don't trust anyone yet," Mira corrected. "That's different. It's not personal." "Fair enough." He almost smiled. "Keep the knife. I think less of you if you didn't." It was that same evening, as the light was failing over the empty fields, that his phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Witt, the only man in his organization who'd known about the estate before Dominic ever went inside it. 2 words, nothing more. "They're asking." Dominic read it twice before he set the phone down and looked at Mira, who was watching him from across the room with the particular stillness of someone who had learned, over 6 long years, to read a man's face before he ever opened his mouth. "What is it?" she asked. "One of Reyes's lieutenants, a man named Costa, is pulling the household staff in for questioning, one by one, starting with anyone who worked nights." Mira went very pale. "How many people know I was on shift that night?" "Enough. It's a household of 40 people, Mira. Somebody's going to remember the schedule, even if nobody remembers seeing you." Dominic stood, already moving toward the window, checking the gravel road out of habit more than expectation. "We need to assume Costa will get to your name within the week. Maybe sooner if he's smart, and from what I know of him, he's smart. What do? We make sure that by the time he does, there's nothing here to find." Vincent Costa had been Salvatore Reyes's second-in-command for 11 years, which meant he had survived 11 years of a man who trusted no one and killed anyone who gave him a reason to wonder. Survival of that kind bred a particular species of caution, and in the 4 days since his boss's death, Costa had used that caution to methodically eliminate every other lieutenant with a claim to the empire, until only he remained standing over the wreckage, a king with no crown yet, and no idea who had killed the man whose throne he now intended to take. He did not believe in natural causes. He had seen Salvatore Reyes eat food he suspected was tampered with and survive. He had watched the man drink whiskey handed to him by strangers at business dinners without so much as a flicker of concern, because the old man had built up a tolerance to half a dozen common poisons over the decades, a habit born of exactly this kind of paranoia. Whatever had killed him, it had been something rare, something patient, something someone had spent a very long time preparing, which meant, in Costa's calculation, it had almost certainly come from inside the house. He sat now in what had been Salvatore's study, behind the same desk, drinking from the same decanter, and reviewed the household staff roster with the flat, unhurried attention of a man who had all the time in the world and none of the mercy. Cross-referenced the night shift for the last 2 weeks, he told the man standing across the desk from him. "I want to know who was on duty that night, who's called in sick since, and who's suddenly decided this is a good time to visit family out of state." "There's a maid," the man said, consulting his own notes. "Mira Solis, 6 years on staff. Hasn't shown up for her shift in 4 days. No call, no notice." Costa set down his glass. 6 years, he repeated slowly. "And she picks this week to disappear. Could be coincidence." "I don't believe in coincidence," Costa said. "I believe in patterns, and a woman who's worked in this house for 6 years and vanishes 4 days after the boss dies of something nobody can explain. That's not a coincidence. That's a confession with extra steps." He stood, straightening his jacket with the same deliberate care Salvatore had once used, as though he had spent 11 years studying not just the man's business but his mannerisms, preparing to wear them the moment the old man finally left an opening. Find her. Quietly. I don't want this turning into a story people tell in bars. I want her found, and I want to know exactly what she knows and exactly who helped her. And if she's working alone? Nobody's ever working alone, Costa said. Somebody taught her or somebody's hiding her or both. Find the thread and pull it until the whole thing unravels. Dominic learned about Costa's inquiry into Myra's name 2 days later, through the same channel that had warned him the questioning had started. A former dockworker named Roman who owed Dominic his life twice over and had, in exchange, spent the last several years quietly working his way into a low-level position inside the Reyes household staff, exactly for moments like this one. They've got her name, Roman said over a burner phone, his voice pitched low even though he was alone. Costa's put 2 men on finding her. They started at her apartment yesterday. Tore the place apart looking for anything, letters, prescriptions, anything that'd point to what she used. Did they find anything? Nothing that points anywhere useful. But they talked to her neighbors. Somebody remembered seeing a car outside her building a few times over the last month. Dark sedan, didn't recognize the plates. Costa's men are running down every dark sedan registered within 20 miles of that street. Dominic felt something cold settle in his stomach. His own car, the one he'd used to drive Mira out of the city that night, was a dark sedan. Unremarkable by design, precisely so it would never draw attention. But precisely because it was unremarkable, it was also nearly impossible to distinguish from 100 others just like it, which meant Costa's men would spend days running down false leads before they ever got close to the truth. Days, but not forever. How much time do we have? He asked. A week, maybe less if they're thorough. Costa's not stupid, and he's not going to stop looking until he's satisfied. Man like that doesn't sit on an unsolved murder that put him in charge. He needs to know who really did it, because if it wasn't a rival, that means somebody inside got to Reyes without anyone noticing, and that scares him worse than any war. Dominic thanked him, ended the call, and sat for a long moment in the farmhouse kitchen with his hands flat on the table, thinking through every possible next move with the same cold clarity he'd once used to plan an assassination that had never come to pass. Mira found him there 20 minutes later, still sitting, still silent. Tell me, she said simply. He told her. She took it better than he expected. No tears, no panic, just a slow, careful nod. The same composure she'd shown him in the pantry 4 days before life had folded itself into something entirely different. Then we move, she said. Before they find this place. This place isn't on any record. It'll take them weeks to connect it to me, and by then what? Myra's voice sharpened. The first real edge he'd heard from her since that first night. You keep saying by then like there's a plan past that, but I don't think there is there? You've spent 4 years planning one night, and I've spent 3 years planning one night, and neither of us thought past the moment he died. We're both improvising now. Dominic didn't argue because she was right, and he respected her too much by then to insult her with a lie. Then we improvise together, he said instead. First thing, we move you somewhere even Roman doesn't know about. Somewhere that exists in exactly no records, connected to exactly no one, not even the people I trust. And you? I stay visible. I keep running my own business. Keep my own men wondering what I'm doing with my nights. Keep Costa's attention on rivals he already suspects instead of a name he hasn't connected to mine yet. He looked at her steadily. The safest thing I can do for you right now is make sure nobody ever has a reason to look at me and think of you in the same thought. Mira studied him for a long moment, and something crossed her face that he couldn't quite name. Not fear, not gratitude exactly, something more complicated sitting in the space between them. You do that, she said slowly. Put distance between us. Even though she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. In 4 days, something had grown in the space of that farmhouse that neither of them had planned for, and neither of them had the language yet to name. Not love, not exactly, not yet, but the early architecture of it, built out of shared grief and mutual recognition and the strange, quiet intimacy of 2 people who had each spent years alone with the same kind of hatred and had finally found someone else who understood the weight of carrying it. I do it because it keeps you alive, Dominic said. Everything else we figure out once you're safe. I'm not walking away from you, Mira. I'm making sure there's a version of this where neither of us has to. They moved that same night to a second property even Roman didn't know existed. A small apartment above a shuttered bakery in a working-class neighborhood 40 minutes from the farmhouse. Registered to a shell company 3 layers removed from anything bearing Dominic's name. He installed her there with enough cash to last a month. A burner phone with only his number programmed into it, and instructions to change her appearance. Hair dyed, a different style of dress, nothing dramatic, just enough to defeat a casual glance from a stranger canvassing a neighborhood with an old photograph. I'll come when I can, he told her, standing in the doorway of the small apartment, feeling, for the first time in 4 years, the strange discomfort of leaving someone behind that he actually wanted to stay with. It might not be often. Costa's men are going to be watching every unusual pattern in this city for the next few weeks, and I can't risk leading them here. I know how to wait, Mira said quietly. I've had 6 years of practice. This is different. Is it? She almost smiled, though there was no real humor in it. I waited 6 years for the right moment to end something. I can wait a few weeks to see whether I get to keep whatever this is. She gestured vaguely between them, and Dominic understood exactly what she meant, even though neither of them had yet found the courage to name it directly. You will, he said. I promise you that. He meant it. He had made very few promises in his life that he intended to keep absolutely, but that one settled into his chest with the weight of an oath, and he carried it with him back out into the city, back into the careful, dangerous work of making sure Vincent Costa never found the thread that led from a poisoned glass of whiskey to a small apartment above a shuttered bakery. The following 2 weeks tested every ounce of patience either of them had left. Costa's search widened. Dark sedans were traced and cleared, one by one, across the city, until his men had exhausted every registered vehicle within the original search radius and begun expanding outward, growing more frustrated and more paranoid with every dead end. Rumors began to spread through the underworld that Reyes hadn't died of natural causes at all, that someone inside his own house had turned on him, that Costa was so desperate to find the culprit that he'd started interrogating staff members who'd left the estate years earlier, dragging old grudges and old fears back into the light. Dominic used the chaos to his advantage. He met openly with 2 of Costa's rivals, letting himself be seen negotiating territory disputes that had nothing to do with Reyes's death, planting himself firmly in the public narrative as a man focused entirely on his own ambitions. He let it be known, quietly, that he had no interest in the power vacuum left by the old man's death, that his concerns lay elsewhere, on the docks his father had once controlled and that Reyes had stolen from the Vale family 4 years before. It was, in its own way, true enough to be convincing, and convincing enough that Costa's attention drifted elsewhere, toward rivals with clearer motives and clearer opportunity. He visited Mira twice in those 2 weeks, each time under cover of legitimate business that could explain his presence in that part of the city, each time staying only long enough to confirm she was safe, to bring supplies, to sit with her for an hour in careful, quiet conversation before he had to leave again. It was on the second visit that she finally asked him the question she'd been holding since the pantry. Do you regret it? She asked. Not being the one who killed him. Dominic considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. They were sitting at the small kitchen table in the apartment above the bakery, a pot of tea going cold between them. Rain, again always rain, it seemed, in this particular chapter of both their lives, ticking softly against the window. No, he said finally. I thought I would. I spent 4 years believing that the only ending that would ever satisfy me was one where I was the last thing he saw before he died. But I've had 2 weeks to sit with what actually happened, and I don't think I regret it at all. He looked at her. I think I got something better. I got to watch a man who spent his whole life taking things from people finally lose to someone he never once considered a threat. There's a kind of justice in that my bullet never could have delivered. And what did you get besides that? He met her eyes steadily. I got you, he said, which is more than I expected to get out of that night, and more than I think I deserve, given everything I walked into that house intending to do. Mira reached across the table and, for the first time since he had first taken her hand in that dim pantry, laced her fingers through his without hesitation, without the careful calculation of a woman still deciding whether to trust him. I think we both got more than either of us expected, she said. I spent 3 years telling myself that once he was dead, it wouldn't matter what happened to me afterward. I hadn't planned past that moment either. She looked down at their joined hands. I'm glad I didn't have to figure out what came after. Alone. You won't have to, Dominic said. Not anymore. The break came in the third week, and it came from a direction neither of them had anticipated. Costa, having exhausted every lead in the city, finally did what a smarter, more patient man might have done from the beginning. He offered a reward. A substantial one, whispered through every channel of the underworld and a few channels that touched the ordinary world as well, for information leading to the maid named Mira Solis. No explanation was given for why she mattered. None was needed. In a city like that, a reward that large was its own explanation, and it meant every low-level informant, every desperate gambler, every person who had ever crossed paths with a woman matching her description began looking twice at every face in every crowd. It was a bartender 3 blocks from the bakery apartment who made the connection. A woman he half remembered from years earlier, now with different hair, buying groceries at the corner store with unusual care, the kind of care that suggested someone trying very hard not to be noticed. He didn't know her name for certain. He wasn't sure enough to be confident. But the reward was large enough that certainty felt like a luxury he could skip, and he made a phone call that afternoon that reached, eventually, one of Costa's men. Dominic's own network caught the ripple before it reached its destination. Roman, still embedded inside what remained of the Reyes organization, overheard 2 of Costa's men discussing a tip that had come in about a woman near the old bakery district, and by the time he managed to get word to Dominic, there were perhaps 6 hours before Costa's men would arrive at that exact block to start knocking on doors. Dominic was at the apartment in 11 minutes, breaking every traffic law he knew and several he'd forgotten existed. "We're leaving," he said, the moment the door opened, already pulling her toward the small bag of essentials they'd kept packed for exactly this possibility. "Now, Costa's men have a tip. We don't know how solid it is, and I'm not willing to find out." Mira didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. 6 years of surviving inside a monster's house had taught her exactly how to move when moving was the only thing that mattered, and within 4 minutes they were back in his car, pulling away from the bakery district as the first hints of Costa's men were still an hour out, still confirming an address, still unaware they had already lost. "Where now?" she asked, once the city had thinned behind them and her breathing had begun to steady. "Somewhere they'll never think to look," Dominic said, "because it's the one place with my name directly attached to it, and no one in their right mind hides a fugitive in a location that obviously connects back to them." Mira looked at him, understanding dawning slowly. "You're taking me to one of your own properties. Somewhere public." "I'm taking you home," Dominic said. "My home. If Costa's men ever get desperate enough to consider it, they'll dismiss it in the first 30 seconds, because it's the single most obvious place in the world for me to hide you, which makes it the last place anyone will actually look." His penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a building he owned outright in the financial district, secured by his own men, watched by his own cameras, insulated by layers of legitimate business that made it nearly impossible for outsiders to move through the lobby without being noticed and questioned. It was, in every practical sense, the safest building in the city, and it was also, Dominic knew, an enormous risk, because it meant folding Mira directly into the visible architecture of his life instead of keeping her hidden at its edges. "If anyone sees you here," he said, as the elevator carried them up in silence, "there's no explaining it away. You become a fact people know about, not a rumor they can dismiss. Is that a problem?" He looked at her, and something in his chest, already strained thin from weeks of careful distance, finally gave way to something simpler and more honest. "No," he said. "It stopped being a problem 3 weeks ago, in a pantry, when you told me you'd already done what I came there to do. I've just been too careful to say so." The elevator doors opened onto the penthouse, and for the first time since that first night, Mira allowed herself to exhale fully, to let her shoulders drop entirely, to stand in a space that felt, against every reasonable expectation, like it might actually be permanent. Costa's men reached the bakery apartment 2 hours after Dominic and Mira had left it. They found an empty space, hastily but not frantically vacated. No clues left behind beyond the general shape of someone who had lived carefully and left quickly. The bartender's tip, once run down, produced nothing but a dead end and a very annoyed Vincent Costa, who spent that evening drinking from his predecessor's decanter and beginning, for the first time, to seriously entertain the idea that whoever had killed Salvatore Reyes had help. Real help, organized help, the kind that could make a person disappear from a building and leave nothing behind but silence. He did not, in the weeks that followed, ever think to look inside Dominic Vale's penthouse. It was, exactly as Dominic had predicted, too obvious a place to conceal anything, and Costa's suspicion drifted instead toward rival organizations, toward old enemies of Reyes scattered across 3 states, toward every possibility except the truth sitting 11 floors above one of the city's busiest financial districts. Months passed. The search for Mira Solis quietly cooled, then stopped altogether, buried beneath Costa's more pressing need to consolidate his own power before someone else's ambition swallowed him the way Reyes's death had swallowed everyone who'd once served beside him. The name Mira Solis became, eventually, just one more loose thread in a city full of them. Unresolved, unimportant, forgotten by everyone except the 2 people who had once sat together in a small pantry during a rainstorm and decided, without quite meaning to, that they would face whatever came next together. A year later, on the anniversary of the night that had changed both their lives, Dominic found Mira standing at the tall windows of the penthouse, looking out over a city that had long since stopped hunting for either of them. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "Every day," Mira said. "Not with grief anymore. Not even really with anger. Just, I think about the version of me who sat in that pantry not knowing whether I'd survive the week, and I try to remember to be grateful for her. She did something most people spend their whole lives too afraid to do." "She did," Dominic agreed. "And she happened to do it on the exact night I finally worked up the nerve to do the same thing." Mira smiled. A real smile now, easy and unguarded in a way it had taken the better part of a year to earn. "I still think about what would have happened if you'd found me 5 minutes later. If I'd already gone up to check on him. If we'd never had that conversation in the pantry at all." "I don't like to think about that version," Dominic admitted. "I like this one better." She turned to face him fully, reaching up to rest her palm against his chest, over the steady, unhurried beat of a heart that had spent 4 years planning a death and had instead, almost by accident, found something worth living for. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'd choose this version too. Every time." Outside, the city carried on the way cities always do, indifferent to the small, quiet reckonings happening inside any one of its million windows. Somewhere across town, Vincent Costa sat behind a desk that had once belonged to a dead man, still chasing rumors that led nowhere, still convinced that somewhere out there was a name he hadn't yet found. He would never find it. Some debts, once paid, simply close, quietly, completely, and for good, leaving behind nothing but 2 people who had once been strangers with the same grief, standing together at the beginning of a life neither of them had planned to survive long enough to have.